the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, and the Gulf of Mexico. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill sent millions of barrels gushing into the Gulf of Mexico, focusing international attention on America's third coast and prompting questions about whether it will ever fully recover from the spill. Now that some of the oil on the surface appears to be dissipating, the notion of a recovery from the spill, repeated by politicians, strikes some as short-sighted. The Gulf of Mexico had been suffering for decades before the explosion of the Deepwater Horizon oil rig on April 20th. There's a tremendous amount of outrage with the oil spill, and rightfully so, said Felicia Coleman, director of Florida State University's Coastal and Marine Laboratory. But where is the outrage at the thousands and millions of little cuts we've made on a daily basis? The Gulf is one of the most diverse ecosystems in the hemisphere, a stopping point for migratory birds from South America to the Arctic, home to abundant wildlife and natural resources. But like no other American body of water, the Gulf of Mexico bears the environmental consequences of the country's economic pursuits and appetites, including oil and corn. There are approximately 4,000 offshore oil and gas platforms and tens of thousands of miles of pipeline in the central and western Gulf of Mexico, where some 90% of the country's offshore drilling takes place. At least 500,000 barrels of oil and drilling fluids had been spilled offshore before the gusher that began after the April 20th explosion, according to government records. There are also at least 27,000 abandoned whales. Much more than that has been spilled from pipelines, vessel traffic, and whales in state waters, including hundreds of spills in Louisiana alone, records show, some of it since April 20th. Runoff and waste from cornfields, sewage plants, golf courses, and oil-stained parking lots drain into the Mississippi River from vast areas of the United States, and then flow down to the Gulf, creating a zone of lifeless water the size of Lake Ontario, just off the coast of Louisiana. The Gulf of Mexico's floor is littered with bombs, chemical weapons, and other ordnance dumped in the middle of last century, even in areas busy with drilling, and miles outside of designated dumping zones, according to experts who work on deepwater hazard surveys. In other words, the Gulf of Mexico was already messed up before the BP oil spill. Now, it's even more messed up. The likelihood of an accident is supposedly low, experts say, but they add that federal hazard mitigation requirements are not strong enough to guarantee the safety of drillers working in the Gulf. Even the coast itself, overdeveloped, strip-mined, and battered by storms, is falling apart. The wildlife-rich coastal wetlands of Louisiana, sliced up and drastically engineered for oil and gas exploration, shipping, and flood control, have lost an area larger than Delaware since 1930. This has been the nation's sacrifice zone, and has been for 50-plus years, said the campaign director for the Gulf Restoration Network, a nonprofit group. What we're seeing now with BP's crude is just a very photogenic representation of that. Again, he said, what we're seeing right now with BP's crude is just a very photogenic representation of that. A history of neglect. All along the coast, people speak of a lack of regulatory commitment and investment in scientific research on the Gulf by state and federal lawmakers. They note, for example, that over the last decade, the environmental protection agencies financing for the Chesapeake Bay Program. A regional and federal partnership was nearly 5 times the amount for a similar Gulf of Mexico program, and a Great Lakes program was given more than 4 times as much. The funding had never been equivalent to other great water bodies, said Lisa Jackson, the administrator for the Environmental Protection Agency. That's absolutely true, but it's also absolutely true that this administration changed that long before the spill. While the Gulf of Mexico program financing remains at roughly the same levels, Ms. Jackson pointed to other programs to address Gulf health that have been created and received tens of millions of dollars in the last 2 years. On July 19th, the Obama administration announced the recommendations of the Interagency Ocean Policy Task Force, a committee created in 2009 to coordinate governance over the country's major bodies of water. The White House also announced the creation of a Gulf Restoration Roadmap before the spill to address the long-term problems on the Louisiana and Mississippi coasts. The details of some of these federal plans remain vague, and the financing is viewed as just a start, but they have raised hopes of a more effective federal approach to the Gulf's problems, an approach that has long been missing, say scientists, lawyers, and environmental advocates. And while billions of dollars would be required to restore the coast, much more than has already been committed, the maintenance of a healthy Gulf also demands rigorous enforcement of regulations. Some of the strongest resistance to tough regulation, as well as the most permissive attitude toward industry and property development, has come from the Gulf states themselves. In a federal ranking of states for annual toxic release, 3 of the top 10 are along the Gulf. So, this has led to a cycle of lax oversight. Members of several national environmental groups said they had found much of the Gulf a hostile fundraising and political atmosphere. They don't have any support in state government. They do have a cost-benefit analysis, and they have decided to spend their money elsewhere. Regional difference. But without the aggressive watchdog role played by well-financed environmental groups in places like California and the Mid-Atlantic, threats to the Gulf of Mexico have largely gone unmonitored. The environmental movement was either so far removed from it that it was unaware, or it was aware and afraid to challenge it because of local politics, or it was unwilling to challenge because it has written off the Gulf of Mexico as America's dumping ground. Oil and gas companies have been drilling offshore in the central and western Gulf for more than 60 years. And yes, there's something much bigger going on here. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill, it has shown the world and the country what is wrong with deepwater oil exploration and recovery, or drilling. It's time to get away from the use of oil or fossil fuels, petroleum. And all these are more signs of the end times, transition days. Revelation chapter 10, verse 5, And the angel which I saw stand upon the sea and upon the earth lifted up his hand to heaven. 6, And swore by him that lives forever and ever, who created heaven and the things that therein are, and the earth and the things that therein are, and the sea and the things which are therein, but there should be time no longer. 7, But in the days of the voice of the 7th angel, when he shall begin to sound, the mystery of God should be finished, as he has declared to his servants the prophets. Yes, it's time, and all these are more signs.